The sky that morning looked as if it understood the sadness of the town. Gray clouds hung low over the small cemetery on the hill, and a quiet drizzle fell steadily, tapping softly against black umbrellas and polished gravestones. People gathered in silence, their coats dark, their faces even darker. Everyone had come to say goodbye to Thomas Bennett. Thomas had lived in the town of Brookdale for more than 40 years. He wasn't rich and he wasn't famous. But if you asked anyone in the town who he was, they would all say the same thing. He was the kindest man you could ever meet. Thomas fixed fences for neighbors who couldn't afford repairs. He shoveled snow from sidewalks that weren't even his. And every Saturday morning, he brought leftover food from the bakery to the animal shelter outside town. But if there was one thing people associated with Thomas more than anything else, it was his dog, a large golden dog named Rusty. Rusty wasn't just a pet. Anyone who saw them together could tell that the two shared something deeper, something almost impossible to explain. They were inseparable. Thomas walked Rusty every morning along the same dirt road near the river. Rusty always trotted slightly ahead, occasionally looking back to make sure Thomas was still there. And Thomas always smiled when he caught Rusty looking. "Don't worry," he would say, chuckling softly. "I'm right here, boy." But 3 days ago, everything changed. Thomas Bennett passed away suddenly in his sleep. The news spread quickly through Brookdale. For a town that small, losing someone like Thomas felt like losing a piece of its heart. Now people stood quietly in the cemetery, listening to the soft voice of the pastor. But there was something strange, something that several people had already noticed. Rusty was not there. At first, people assumed someone had taken the dog home. Perhaps the shelter had picked him up. Maybe a neighbor was watching him. After all, bringing a dog to a funeral would be unusual. Still, it felt wrong. For 10 years, Rusty had never been far from Thomas. Not once. The pastor cleared his throat and continued speaking gently. Thomas Bennett believed in kindness above all things. He believed that small acts of love could change the world. The words drifted through the cold air. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. Others stared quietly at the wooden casket beside the open grave. Then suddenly, a sound broke the silence. A bark. Sharp, loud, echoing across the cemetery. Everyone turned at once. At the top of the hill, near the iron gate, a golden shape appeared through the mist. Rusty. The dog stood there, soaked from the rain, his fur darker than usual and clinging to his body. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply looked at the crowd, looked at the casket. And then something happened that no one there would ever forget. Rusty began to run. Not wildly, not aggressively, but with a strange urgency, like he already knew exactly where he needed to go. People stepped aside instinctively as the dog raced between them. A few gasps filled the air. Is that Rusty? How did he get here? Someone stop him! But no one moved fast enough. Rusty reached the casket and suddenly stopped. Completely still. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he stared at the wooden box. The rain continued falling around him. For several seconds, the entire cemetery was silent. Then Rusty slowly approached. He sniffed the edge of the casket. Once. Twice. His tail didn't wag. Instead, something heartbreaking happened. Rusty let out a soft whine, a sound so full of confusion and sadness that several people immediately covered their mouths. It was the sound of a creature that didn't understand why the one person he loved most wasn't answering him anymore. Rusty circled the casket once. Then he did something that made the entire crowd freeze. The dog gently placed his front paws on the side of the coffin and rested his head against the wood, as if he were trying to listen, or maybe hoping, just hoping that he would hear Thomas's voice again. "Hey there, boy." But no voice came, only rain. The pastor stopped speaking. No one dared interrupt the moment. Even the wind seemed to quiet down. Then Rusty began to whimper softly. Not barking, not howling, just small, broken sounds. And for many people standing there, that was the moment their tears truly began. Because for the first time, they understood something painful. Rusty had not just lost an owner. He had lost his entire world. But what no one knew yet, what no one could possibly imagine, was that Rusty hadn't come to the funeral just to say goodbye. He had come for a reason that would soon leave the entire town in shock. And before the day ended, Rusty would do something that no one present would ever forget for the rest of their lives. Something that would make people question what animals truly understand about love, loss, and loyalty. And it all began just a few minutes later, when Rusty suddenly lifted his head from the casket and started digging right beside it. For a moment, no one understood what Rusty was doing. The golden dog stood beside the casket, his body tense, his nose pressed to the wet earth. Then, suddenly, he began scratching at the ground. At first it was slow, one paw, then the other. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound of claws against damp soil broke the heavy silence of the cemetery. People looked at each other in confusion. "Is someone going to stop him?" a woman whispered, but no one moved. Rusty dug with increasing urgency, dirt scattering behind him. His breathing grew faster, almost desperate. The pastor stepped closer, uncertain. "Maybe someone should—" But before he could finish, Rusty stopped. He froze, his ears lifted. Then he barked, not a playful bark, not even an angry one. This bark was sharp and commanding, echoing across the graves. Everyone jumped slightly. Rusty barked again. Then he began digging even faster. Dirt flew everywhere now. The careful lines of the grave were quickly becoming messy. A man from the cemetery staff rushed forward. "Hey, hey, stop the dog!" But as he approached, Rusty turned and growled, not aggressively, but firmly, as if saying, "Don't come closer." The man hesitated. "That's strange," someone murmured behind him. Rusty had always been gentle. Everyone in Brookdale knew that. Children hugged him. Elderly neighbors fed him biscuits from their pockets. No one had ever seen him behave like this. Yet here he was, standing protectively over a patch of freshly disturbed soil. And then something even stranger happened. Rusty stopped digging again. He sniffed the hole intensely. Then he looked directly at the people gathered around. His eyes were wide, alert, almost pleading. To be honest, it's hard to explain what many people felt in that moment. It was as if the dog was trying to tell them something. But of course, that couldn't be possible. Dogs didn't understand funerals. Dogs didn't know about graves. At least, that's what everyone believed. Rusty barked again, short, urgent. Then he scratched the earth once more. The cemetery worker sighed. "We really need to move him," he said quietly. But just as he stepped forward again, an elderly woman suddenly spoke. "Wait!" Her voice trembled slightly. It was Mrs. Calder, Thomas's neighbor for nearly 20 years. She slowly walked closer, leaning on her cane. "Let him be for a moment," she said. "Why?" the worker asked. She stared at the dog carefully. "I've known Rusty since he was a puppy, and I've never seen him act like this without a reason." The small crowd murmured. The pastor exchanged glances with Thomas's niece, Emily, who had organized the funeral. Emily wiped her eyes and nodded slightly. "All right," she said softly. "Let's just watch." Rusty continued digging. His paws were muddy now. The hole grew deeper. 5 minutes passed, then 7. People shifted nervously in the cold drizzle. Finally, one of the cemetery workers shook his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. But just as he stepped closer again, Rusty suddenly stopped, completely. His body stiffened, his ears pointed forward. He lowered his nose deep into the hole and sniffed carefully. Once, twice, then he whined, a long, trembling sound. Rusty backed away slightly. Then he barked again, louder this time, and began scratching at the side of the hole, not downward anymore, but sideways. That was when the worker noticed something. He frowned. "Hold on," he said slowly. Another worker approached. "What is it?" The first man brushed away more dirt with his hands, and then his fingers hit something hard. Not rock, not root, something flat. The worker froze. "Wait," he said slowly. Another worker approached. "What is it?" The first man brushed more dirt away, and then the shape became clearer. Wood. A wooden surface. The crowd murmured loudly now. "That can't be right," someone whispered. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, because what Rusty had uncovered looked very much like another box beneath the soil. But that didn't make sense. This grave had been freshly prepared just yesterday. There shouldn't have been anything buried there, not anything at all. Rusty began whining again, pacing anxiously beside them. His tail was low, his eyes locked on the ground, almost as if he were urging them, "Keep digging." The workers hesitated. Finally, the older one stood up and looked at Emily. "Miss Bennett, we may need to check this." Emily looked pale. "What do you mean?" "There might be something buried here already." Gasps spread through the crowd. The pastor removed his glasses slowly. "That's impossible." But Rusty barked again, and this time the sound sent a chill through everyone present, because the dog wasn't acting confused anymore. He was acting certain. And deep down, a strange feeling began spreading through the people standing in the rain. A feeling that this loyal dog had not just come to say goodbye. He had come to reveal something, something buried beneath the ground, something no one in Brookdale was supposed to find. And as the workers grabbed shovels and carefully began clearing the dirt around the wooden surface, Rusty sat beside the grave, watching, waiting, as if he already knew exactly what they were about to uncover. And within minutes, the funeral would turn into something no one there had ever imagined, something that would shake the entire town and prove that Rusty's loyalty was far more powerful and mysterious than anyone had ever believed. The rain grew heavier as the workers continued digging. At first, they moved carefully, using small shovels to remove the dirt around the wooden surface Rusty had revealed. The people gathered for the funeral slowly formed a wider circle around the grave. Nobody spoke much anymore. The atmosphere had changed. What had started as a quiet farewell was now filled with tension, curiosity, and something else. A strange sense of unease. Rusty sat only a few feet away, his muddy paws planted firmly on the ground. His golden fur was soaked, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes never left the hole, not even for a second. To be honest, several people later said that what unsettled them the most was how focused the dog looked. Not confused, not scared, focused, as if he had been waiting for this moment. One of the workers wiped rain from his forehead and pushed more dirt aside. "It's definitely a box," he said quietly. The second worker crouched beside him. "How deep?" "About 2 feet under the surface." "That shouldn't be here," the second man muttered. More dirt came away. Soon the rectangular shape was clearly visible. It was an old wooden chest, smaller than a coffin, maybe 3 feet long. The wood looked dark with age, and metal corners reinforced the edges. A rusty latch was visible on the front. People began whispering again. What is that? Was something buried here before? Maybe an old grave. But the cemetery had records going back more than 100 years. This area had been empty until yesterday when Thomas's burial had been prepared. Which meant one thing. The chest had been buried recently. The first worker looked up at Emily. What do you want us to do? Emily stood frozen for a moment, her face pale. She looked at the casket, then at Rusty, then back at the strange wooden box emerging from the ground. I think we need to open it, she said quietly. The workers exchanged glances. One of them carefully cleared the last layer of dirt from the lid. The old chest was finally free. They lifted it gently and placed it on the grass beside the grave. Mud dripped from the bottom. The crowd leaned closer. Rusty stood up immediately. His tail began to move slowly, not wagging with happiness, but swaying with intense anticipation. The older worker knelt beside the chest. "All right," he said. He brushed dirt away from the latch. The metal creaked softly when he touched it. "Looks old," someone whispered. But as the man pushed the latch open, something unexpected happened. Rusty let out a low whine. Not fear, not warning. Something closer to sadness. The lid lifted with a long, dry creak, and inside the chest, there were dozens of envelopes, old letters, bundles of papers tied with faded string, photographs, and one small leather notebook. The worker frowned. "That's it?" he said quietly. The crowd looked confused. People had clearly expected something dramatic, something dangerous, but it was just paper. Emily stepped forward slowly. "May I?" she asked. The worker nodded. She knelt beside the chest and picked up one of the photographs. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she whispered. The pastor leaned closer. "What is it?" Emily held up the picture. It showed Thomas Bennett as a young man standing beside another man no one in town recognized. Behind them was a military vehicle. Both men wore uniforms. "That's my uncle," Emily said softly. "But he never talked about this." More photos appeared as she searched through the chest. Pictures from decades ago, military bases, tents in distant places, groups of soldiers smiling for the camera. Then Emily opened one of the envelopes. Inside was a letter. The paper was yellow with age. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat but faded. At the top of the page was a date, March 12, 1976, almost 50 years ago. Emily began reading silently, and suddenly her expression changed. Confusion, shock, then something deeper, emotion. "What is it?" the pastor asked gently. Emily swallowed. "These are letters from someone named Daniel." "Daniel who?" someone asked. "I don't know." She read another line, then another, and suddenly her hand covered her mouth. "Oh, Uncle Thomas." The pastor crouched beside her. "What does it say?" Emily hesitated. Then she read aloud. "Thomas, if you're reading this, it means you finally came back to the place where we promised to bury the truth." The crowd grew very quiet. The rain tapped softly on umbrellas. Emily continued reading slowly. "We were told to forget what happened that night, to pretend the village fire was an accident, but we both know it wasn't." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Emily looked up, stunned. "These letters talk about something that happened during the war." Rusty stepped closer to her. He sniffed the edge of the chest. Then he gently rested his head against Emily's shoulder, as if offering comfort. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. "He kept all of this hidden," she whispered. "But why bury it here?" No one answered, but Rusty suddenly lifted his head. His ears twitched, and he looked directly at the small leather notebook still resting inside the chest. He nudged it with his nose, once, twice. Emily noticed. "You want me to open that?" she asked softly. Rusty stared at the notebook, completely still. And for some reason, everyone watching felt the same strange thought at the exact same time. The dog hadn't led them to the chest for the letters. He had led them to that notebook. And whatever was written inside it was something Thomas Bennett had carried in silence for almost half a century. Something so heavy that even after his death, his loyal dog had come back to make sure the truth was finally revealed. Emily slowly picked up the notebook. Her hands trembled. She opened the first page, and what she read there made her gasp. Emily's hands trembled as she opened the small leather notebook. The pages were worn, their edges softened by time. The first line was written in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. Slow, careful, almost as if every word had been difficult to write. Emily swallowed and began reading aloud. "If anyone is reading this, it means Rusty has done what I hoped he would do one day." A quiet murmur rippled through the people gathered around the grave. Emily continued. "Rusty is smarter than most people realize. I trained him for years to remember this place. I prayed he would never need to bring anyone here, but if he did, it means the truth finally deserves to be known." The pastor leaned closer, his expression serious. "Truth about what?" someone whispered. Emily turned the page. The rain had grown lighter now, but no one noticed. Everyone stood frozen, listening. She read the next lines slowly. "In 1976, during my service overseas, my closest friend was a man named Daniel Reyes. Daniel was the bravest man I ever knew, but one night, something happened that changed both of our lives forever." Emily paused. Her voice wavered slightly, but she continued. "Our unit was stationed near a small village. One evening we were ordered to burn it down. The official report said the village was abandoned and being used by enemy forces, but when we arrived, we discovered families still living there, children, elderly people, innocent people." A shocked silence fell over the cemetery. Emily's voice grew quieter. "Daniel refused the order. He stood in front of the commanding officer and said he would not participate. I should have stood beside him. I wish every day that I had." Emily blinked back tears and turned another page. "They arrested Daniel that night for disobedience. The next morning, the village was destroyed anyway. The official story said Daniel had deserted his post, but the truth is, he tried to stop something terrible." The crowd exchanged uneasy glances. Emily continued reading. "Before they took him away, Daniel handed me a box. Inside were letters he had written to his family and photographs from our time in the army. He told me to hide them somewhere safe until the truth could one day come out." Emily slowly looked down at the chest beside the grave. The letters, the photos, everything suddenly made sense. She kept reading. "I carried that box with me for years, but I was afraid. Afraid that no one would believe the story. Afraid that speaking out would bring trouble to my family." Her voice softened. "So I buried the box here in Brookdale, far from everything. I told myself I would reveal the truth someday, but life passed and I never found the courage." A tear rolled down Emily's cheek. The pastor gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She took a deep breath and read the final paragraph on the page. "When I adopted Rusty from the shelter 10 years ago, I began visiting this spot again. I trained him to remember the scent of the box and the exact place where it was buried. If something ever happened to me before I told the truth, Rusty would lead people here." Gasps spread through the crowd. Emily looked up slowly. "So, he knew," she whispered. The pastor nodded quietly. "Your uncle planned this." Rusty sat beside the open chest. His tail rested calmly against the wet grass, almost as if he understood every word. Emily turned the page again, but this time something fell out of the notebook. A folded document. The paper was thicker than the others. Emily picked it up and carefully unfolded it. Her eyes widened. "What is it?" someone asked. "It's an official report," she said. The pastor leaned closer. Emily read the heading. "Military Court Record, Case of Sergeant Daniel Reyes." A low murmur spread through the crowd. Emily scanned the document. Her voice shook when she spoke again. "This says Daniel was sentenced for desertion and dishonorably discharged." She paused. "But according to these letters, he wasn't a deserter." The pastor nodded slowly. He was trying to stop a crime. Emily looked down at Rusty. The dog gazed back at her quietly, and for a moment, something incredible became clear. Rusty had not come to the funeral simply to mourn. He had come to finish a mission his owner had entrusted to him, to reveal the truth that had been buried for 50 years. Emily wiped her tears. "We can't keep this hidden." "No," the pastor agreed. "The truth deserves to be known." But just as Emily closed the notebook, suddenly Rusty stood up again. His ears lifted sharply. He looked toward the cemetery gate. Then he barked, once, loud and sudden. Everyone turned. A black car had just pulled into the cemetery parking area. 2 men stepped out, both wearing dark coats. And when they began walking toward the crowd, something about their expressions made several people feel uneasy. Emily frowned slightly. "Do you know them?" the pastor asked. She shook her head. "No." Rusty began growling softly, low, protective. And for the first time that day, a chilling thought crossed several people's minds. What if the truth buried in that box was something someone else never wanted discovered? And what if Rusty had only just begun the final part of his owner's plan? The 2 men walked slowly up the cemetery path. Their shoes sank slightly into the wet gravel as they approached the gathering crowd. Neither of them carried umbrellas, and the light rain darkened their coats. People instinctively stepped aside to let them pass. There was something about their presence that immediately shifted the atmosphere again. Emily felt it too. Rusty stood beside her now, his body alert. His ears were forward, and a quiet growl vibrated deep in his chest. The taller of the 2 men stopped a few feet from the grave. He looked at the open chest, the scattered letters, the notebook in Emily's hands. Then he looked up at her. "Are you Emily Bennett?" he asked calmly. Emily hesitated for a moment. "Yes, I am." The man nodded slowly. "My name is Michael Reyes." The name seemed to echo through the group. Emily blinked. "Reyes?" she repeated. The man gestured gently toward the chest. "My father was Daniel Reyes." A wave of murmurs spread through the people standing around them. Emily stared at him, stunned. "You're his son?" Michael nodded. "Yes." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Rusty stopped growling, but he continued watching the man carefully. Michael glanced at the notebook. "So he finally told the truth," he said quietly. Emily swallowed. "You knew about this?" Michael sighed softly. "Not everything." He looked around at the crowd, then back at Emily. "My father spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name," he explained. "But the military records never changed. To everyone else, he was just a soldier who ran away." The second man beside him finally spoke. "My name is Jonathan Cole," he said. "I'm a military historian." Emily frowned slightly. "Why are you here?" Jonathan looked at the chest. "Because 3 weeks ago," he said carefully, "we received a letter." Emily's eyes widened. "A letter?" Michael nodded. "It was from your uncle." The crowd gasped softly. Emily shook her head in disbelief. "But my uncle died only 3 days ago." Michael reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope sealed in plastic to protect it from the rain. He handed it to her. "The letter was dated 2 months ago," he explained. "He said that if anything happened to him, we should come to Brookdale on the day of his funeral." Emily carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a short handwritten note. She recognized Thomas's handwriting immediately. Her voice trembled as she read it aloud. "Michael, if you are reading this, I'm afraid time finally caught up with me. I carried the truth about your father for too long. I buried the evidence in the Brookdale Cemetery many years ago. If Rusty brings people to the spot, it means the truth has finally come out. Please forgive me for waiting so long. Your father was a hero. Thomas Bennett." When Emily finished reading, the cemetery was completely silent. Michael closed his eyes briefly. For a moment, it looked like he was struggling to keep his composure. Then he exhaled slowly. "My father died 5 years ago," he quieted. "He never stopped saying the same thing." Emily looked at him gently. "What did he say?" Michael's voice softened. He said, "One day, the truth will come out. Thomas will make it right." Emily looked down at Rusty. The dog sat calmly beside the chest, as if he understood the importance of the moment. Jonathan, the historian, crouched beside the letters. He carefully examined one of the documents. "These are incredible," he said. Emily looked at him. "What do you mean?" Jonathan held up a paper. "This is an original field report. If these documents are authentic, they prove Daniel Reyes disobeyed orders to protect civilians." Michael stared at him. "You're saying—" Jonathan nodded. "Yes." He looked around at the crowd. This could officially clear his name. Emily felt her chest tighten. All these years, all that silence, and now the truth was finally here. Rusty suddenly stood and walked slowly toward Michael. The man watched the dog approach. Rusty sniffed his hand, then gently wagged his tail. Michael smiled sadly. "My father loved dogs," he said softly. "They always understand loyalty better than humans do." Rusty leaned his head briefly against Michael's leg, as if acknowledging something, or perhaps completing the final part of Thomas's promise. Emily looked around at the people gathered in the rain. What had started as a funeral had become something else entirely. A revelation. A story buried for half a century was finally coming to light. But the most incredible part of it all was that the truth had only been discovered because of a loyal dog who refused to forget. Rusty, the dog who had waited patiently for the moment when his owner's final wish could be fulfilled. And as the rain slowly stopped and sunlight began to break through the gray clouds, many people in Brookdale would later say the same thing. Thomas Bennett had been a good man, but Rusty had made sure the world would remember why. To be honest, stories like this are difficult to believe. A dog remembering a place for 10 years, leading people to a hidden truth, fulfilling the final wish of the person they loved most. But sometimes, loyalty doesn't follow logic. Sometimes it follows the heart. And Rusty proved something that day in the small cemetery of Brookdale. Love doesn't always end with goodbye. Sometimes it finishes the story. If you enjoyed this story, I'm curious about something. What is the name of your dog or a pet that changed your life? Many people say animals understand us in ways humans sometimes cannot. Share your story.